Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. It is great to be here today on this very special time that I can stream with some people from the UK, which is something I don't get to do often because my normal stream time on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Central is an ungodly hour across the pond.
Most definitely.
So, welcome, Dave, and welcome, Joe. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us on. Yeah.
And I want to say hello to everyone in the chat. Welcome to Claire Bear and to Crabby Hermit, to Godless Scummer. Those are the only three that I see at the moment. I know there's a few more out there, but those are the ones. Oh, and Cosgood Zolomon and Verillion. Great to have all of you here. Okay, I wanted to do something that's kind of along an educational line to a certain extent here in discussing logic and reason. And part of what brought this about was I was noticing that when I have conversations, sometimes I am conversing with someone. And all of a sudden, they say something that is so completely illogical that I realize, oh my goodness, I'm dealing with someone that doesn't know how to reason. And I'm not sure what to do with that. I just assume that everyone has about the same reasoning abilities that I do. And on the flip side, sometimes I'm in a conversation with something and I'll say something and they will point out to me how incredibly stupid it was and my own complete lack of reason in it. And so I'm wondering, how do we analyze our own conversations to be able to reason better?
Do you want to go, Joe?
God, I mean that's a really big question, to be honest.
It is. It's huge.
I mean, there's many different types of reasoning and everything like that, and I suppose it depends what you mean. I mean, if by talking about reason, to be a good reasoner, what you're trying to do is trying to reason your way to holding a rational position, and so then you have to open up the question of, well, what is rationality? And rationality is, at least in part, reasoning using the rules of logic and probability theory and holding consistent and coherent beliefs, having no strong evidence against your position that you're just, waving your hand at. And that's what you're trying to get. You're trying to justify your position to make it rational. Now, obviously, rational doesn't necessarily mean it's correct either. You could have be correct and be irrational in your reasoning. Like you could accept that the Earth was an oblate spheroid just because, well, my mate said, and that isn't really showing good reasoning. You haven't reasoned through that at all. You just accept someone saying so, unless you have reasoned and they go, well, they're actually a scientist that work with this sort of thing. And you've got all these other layers of reasoning there. And equally, you could reason really well and hold a very rational position, but unknown to you, it could be a false position. But from there, you obviously need to break down into what do we mean by things like the rules of logic. And Dave, do you want to cover off this bit?
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so I'm going to kind of focus on classical logic here. Mostly, there are several types of different logic, but I'm mostly versed in classical logic, which is sort of the standard logic that most of us will reason by. And the idea of logic is that we create these arguments, and each argument is built up of premises and a conclusion, and each premise and the conclusion is a proposition. So an argument is either valid or invalid. And if it follows the rules of logic properly and follows the correct inferences, it'll be a valid argument. And if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And then you have what's known as a sound argument. So an argument can't be true, only the conclusion and the premises can be true. And you kind of have to follow those inferences through. So if I say something like, I am either on Godless Granny stream right now, or I am on Answers and Reason stream right now. I am on Godless Granny stream, so therefore I am not on Answers and Reason stream. And if none of those inferences kind of hold through, like if I was to say the same argument but go, I am on Answers in Reason stream, therefore I am not on Godless Granny stream, that would be kind of false. But in the sense of logic, it doesn't really matter whether those are true. If you want to, it doesn't care whether premises are true unless you're looking for a sound argument.
Can't you have true premise but a faulty conclusion because the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise?
Indeed, but that would then be invalid structure.
It would be an invalid argument,
okay.
and it would be because you aren't following the inferences through to the conclusion properly.
Okay.
An example of that. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah,
hello.
You're a bit choppy, Dave.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, an example of that I could give is something like, all cats have 4 legs. My table has 4 legs. Therefore, my table is a cat.
Right.
Yeah, and that's because you're kind of distributing word fruits in it, and all x's are y's. You want to distribute the x and not the y, get the inference through properly. All cats have 4 legs.
Dave,
I'm sorry.
your connection's being a bit of a knob today.
Living in the countryside. I'm sorry. Can you hear me again now?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It happens sometimes. Yeah, so in an argument like that, if you were to say all cats have 4 legs, my cat is a cat, therefore my cat has 4 legs. That's how it should work. You want to distribute the A and the B to get the actual proper inference through to the conclusion. And one of the things about reasoning, like you said, sometimes you'll come across somebody who you think is completely illogical, and that's because all our background knowledges are different. And most of us haven't really studied logic. So we just go by basically folk logic is kind of a common thing. An example of folk logic is the claim you can't prove a negative. That's like a really popular saying, but that's not actually something in logic. So for some people, you saying you can't prove a negative will sound completely logical because that's how they've kind of learned what logic is. And for somebody else, they'll think what you're saying is completely illogical. Does that make sense?
Do you find that the major issues with logic with people come from faulty premise, failure to follow to the conclusion, or a mix of both?
I'd say a mix of both.
And probably more as well. As Dave just mentioned about, sort of the folk logic, a general misunderstanding of what it actually means to be logical and things like the structure and, conflating the terms like valid and sound. A common one that you'll hear is something like the kalam is not a valid argument. And that's because they think it's unsound. But actually, it can be unsound but still be valid. The kalam is perfectly valid. It just might not be sound.
Explain the difference. I don't understand the difference.
Okay, so validity speaks to the structure of the argument. So the premises necessitate the conclusion. It follows through. So if the two premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they are true. So it's a valid structure. Now, if we suddenly had information and knew that those two premises were true, then that argument would be sound because it would necessitate the conclusion being true as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So the inference in this one would be if A, then B. That would be the first premise. And so in the second premise, you have A. So in the conclusion, it can only follow B, because if it's not A, then B can't follow.
Yeah, and that's a deductive syllogism, basically, and we will come up to the types of reasoning later, but I think we still need to
Inductive and
focus a little bit
abductive,
more.
yeah.
We need to focus a little bit more on the logic side and the rules of logic before we get to that point.
Okay. Okay. One thing that was revolutionary for me as an undergrad was when a professor taught me how to outline. I was in a speech class, and the professor taught us how to correctly outline a speech. And he told me something that was one of the most profound things I have heard for my entire life, and it has shaped just about everything for me, which was if you apply this to everything, you will find that everything you do flows better. And he said, particularly essays, when you answer an essay question on a test, use this outline format and your essay will follow. And he was right. I write fantastic essay tests. I loved essay tests. And taking tests is actually the thing that I do best. I wished that I could find a career in test taking because I'm very good at it. Um, and is it the same thing with logic? If you use a syllogism and organize your logical structure first, is that more likely to help your argument?
I'd say so. It definitely help you
Yeah,
have
most definitely.
a valid argument at the very least. It'll help your structure. It will help ensure that you have a rational position, that you have reasoned to the best of your ability.
Yeah, and you'll be able to argue that a lot better, because if somebody says, well, that's not logical, you can say, well, show me where the reasoning and the logic is faulty. And now I noticed somebody post and say some cats have 3 legs, some cats have 2 legs, but that would only speak to the soundness of the argument rather than the actual logic of the argument and the valid structure of the argument.
Okay. Godless Scummer says, where are all the atheists yelling the kalam isn't valid?
Yeah, I'm surprised they haven't spoke up yet.
Yeah, I see. I think that speaks to something else that you mentioned earlier about some people finding something logical and some people not. Is that the term valid is used very differently colloquially than it is in terms of logic. Valid in logic just means that the structure is good, the inferences follow, and it would be impossible to deny the truth of the conclusion if the premises are true. But for most people in everyday life, valid just means acceptable.
Okay. Okay. So we really need to discuss the definitions better. We need to determine what someone means by valid. Okay.
Yeah, most
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I know most people hate this definition discussions. And I can understand why, because they kind of get tied down a lot. And you can obviously miss the actual point of the argument. But sometimes when you're speaking in a particular context or in a particular kind of situation, there are technical definitions that matter to that specific context, sort of like theory in everyday language and theory in science.
Paula Gia just did a recent live stream where he discussed whether or not he would ever have a debate with Kent Hovind. And he has an excellent discussion of definitions and debates. And one of the things that he discussed was that if you get tied down in discussing the definition during the debate, for one thing, you make the debate boring for the audience. And so really, if you want to have a good debate, you need to agree on the definitions before the debate.
Yeah.
And that
Agreed.
was, and it was a really good discussion.
It's one of the things that we actually try to do with our articles. For example, I know that the word atheist or atheism, they're both polysemous terms. So is agnosticism and all of that. There's a number of different ways that it can be taken. And so what we try and do at the beginning of an article, say, like, I know this term is polysemous, and this is how we are going to be using it for the context of this article. And sometimes we might use it in the more philosophical sense as, you know, the belief or proposition gods do not exist. Or sometimes we might use it in the more colloquial sense where we're equating all forms of non-theist as atheists. It's, you know, the thing is, if you put the definition down first, hopefully someone will just go, okay, well, that's how you're using it. I can see how you're using it for the article, and can go on from there. And that can be the same with the debate. Yet you still find people who are very passionate about a particular word, especially one that relates to identity, such as an atheist, will spend more time arguing that, no, you shouldn't have used it that way because it means this, than actually the content of the article. And that can also happen in debate. You start having a thing and say, right, should we use the terms this way, this way, this way? No, and you end up back and forth for ages. And it's like, well, look, how do you want to use them? And generally, if you're in a debate, that's just it. You know, try and use your discussion partner's definitions and work with it. And you might have to make a mental note and translate it. You know, if someone goes, oh, well, I'm using this word, and I go, right, what you actually mean by that is this. And I sort of like maybe even write it down. That way I know in future when they say that, I'm not going to then talk past them by using it my way.
Yeah, a good example of how a debate can be kind of derail quite easily and never actually get to the topic is one on modern day debates between John Lennox and Randolph Richardson. The discussion was supposed to be about whether atheism could be rational, and John Maddox spent 2 hours arguing over the definition of atheism.
Oh gosh. Oh goodness gracious.
Yeah.
Ugh. Yeah, that would not make for a good debate. And thank you very much for the
Yeah, it
super
doesn't.
chat, native atheist. One thing that I run into on a somewhat frequent basis because of what circles I tend to run in is the claim that atheists steal logic from God, and that logic originates from God, and therefore the only reason that anyone can use logic is because God gave you that ability.
Yeah, I hear
Obviously,
that a lot.
you do. Okay. What do you think is the origin of logic? Do animals use logic?
It's a good one.
I think you could say that some of them do. They use a kind of practical logic, and what we would call everyday logic. I'm hungry. I don't want to be hungry. I'm going to go find something to eat. Or
you can see them using tools like working out through problems, can't you? You see them reasoning. They've got these little sticks that they're poking in, and they're pulling out the ants and whatever. You know, they are reasoning. They are using a form of logic.
Yeah, they're using what's known as practical reasoning, and there's also theoretical reasoning, which is like deductive arguments. Inductive would be sort of practical reasoning, I guess, or like figuring out that you have no milk, therefore, if you want a cup of tea, you need to go to the shop and get milk. But I don't kind of buy it's basically a precept argument. In order to know that logic works, you have to get it from some being who understands how logic works, because otherwise you're just presupposing logic. It's good enough to just say you presuppose logic, because when we put it into application, it seems to work and seems to give us good results and seems to give us the good answers.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you could almost make an argument that logic is potentially something that we've discovered. It could be part of the universe. You know, in the same way that you could say the same about numbers. Our language may have given it form, but it's just something that is part of the universe in and of itself.
Well, that's one thing they say about logic. You'll hear a lot of people saying it's descriptive. And I think that is true to some sense. We discovered logic through the way we saw the universe and the way we kind of described our environment. Like, take the law of identity, for example. An apple is an apple, or godless granny is godless granny, and not godless. She can't be not godless granny.
I
so
thought
we
you were
discover
gonna
that
say she can't be godless scummer.
No. Well, that's true as well. Yeah, I mean, that's true as well. So we discovered these things by looking at them, and we've discovered things can't be both true and false at the same time because that's a contradiction.
So you
But
can't be
logic is
both
also kind
godless
of
granny
normative.
and not godless granny.
And not godless granny, yeah. And another one is something is either true or false. Any statement is either true or false. There is no middle ground. So that would be the three classical laws of logic: law of identity, law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. And you could say we've sort of discovered that simply by looking at our environment and creating this language of logic. But logic is also kind of normative in that it has these rules, and if you want to be reasoning in a logical manner, then you have to use the rules of logic.
Now, when you say that a statement is either true or false, can you clarify that a bit? Because, obviously some
So,
statements can be
a
true in certain
proposition.
situations.
Yeah, what's meant by a statement here is like a proposition. So if we declare
Okay.
something about the world, like that is Joe from Answers in Reason. That's a proposition. So it describes something either true or false about the universe. But there are some statements that could be considered to be just sort of descriptions of our feelings.
Okay.
That sunset is beautiful. But then there would be a proposition behind that as well, in that if I was to say, I think that is beautiful, there's a proposition that goes, Dave thinks that sunset is beautiful.
I was thinking more along the lines of, okay, stealing is wrong as a general axiom, but stealing to feed your starving family when you have no other options is not wrong.
You're adding context there.
Okay.
And it also depends on how you take it. You could say that the action of stealing is still wrong, but it was the right action to do because there's a worse consequence. So you almost have a problem of dirty hands there, where what you're saying is what you've done the wrong thing, but for a greater good.
Okay.
Yeah, and you could also argue something like error theorists, where this sounds like it's a true statement or a statement that could be true, but it's always false because it doesn't map onto anything in reality.
Yeah,
or you could go with something like expressivism,
non-cog.
where you're
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
yeah, you're just expressing some attitude that you have or feeling that you have.
Yeah. So it really depends on your take.
Yeah, a statement like that. Yeah.
Let's go into the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. Now, Dave, you said a few minutes ago that we weren't quite there yet. We weren't quite ready. Is there some groundwork you need to lay before we go into that?
Well, no, I can go into that now.
Okay.
I mean, it'd be a pretty good segue. So an inductive argument is an argument that we build from experience of things. It's an argument that generally tends or tries to lead from particulars to universals. So every time I hit the cue ball into that triangle of pool balls, the pool ball's scattered. Therefore, every time I hit this, or it's probably likely that when I hit this cue ball, it's going to hit the pack of balls and they're going to scatter. Or the black swan fallacy kind of comes from this. Every swan I have ever encountered, every swan I have ever encountered is white, therefore all swans are white. And a deductive argument tries to go from generalities to particulars. So like the all cats have four legs. Furry meow is a cat, therefore furry meow has four legs. Science basically works on induction.
I was just going to say, science itself works on induction. It's very rigorous, very well justified induction. But anyone who thinks any form of inductive argument is bad just because it's inductive, well, no. Science works on a combination these days of induction and deduction. I mean, all the gathering evidence and looking for patterns and making observations and analogous behavior. They're all inductive parts of the reasoning process with science. And then what you try and do is the falsification process is you're trying to prove that theory that you've then built false each time. And the only deductive part comes is when you've actually proven it false. Until then, it's purely inductive, but it might be really, really, really strong induction, right? We've tried to this, experimented 1,000 different times, 1,000 different ways, and it's still holding true. So for now, it can be considered true until it's proven false.
I think the classic example.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, David Hume has this argument, which is the problem of induction, in that we have no good reason to say that one event will follow the other just because we've experienced it a million times in the past. We're just sort of supposing that it's going to continue like that. But that only affects, if you were to say, like the black swan fallacy, all swans I've encountered are white, therefore all swans are white. But if you were to say something like, every swan I've encountered is white, therefore the next one I probably see will be white. You're not excluding the opportunity of seeing a different color. You're just saying, based on all these inferences, it's probable that the next one will be white.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing to remember with inductive reasoning. You're saying what's probably going to be the case. And you have to be very aware of how big your data set actually is. If you've traveled the world and you've seen every single country, and in every single country you've seen, all the swans are white, it's much better than, well, I've just lived in one town in England and the swans there were white. That's sort of going more into the realms of abductive reasoning because you've got a very incomplete set, sort of.
Okay, very good. That goes, I keep tying what you're saying to other things that I've seen and trying to apply them. And that goes very much to a stream that Erica Gutsick-Gibbon did just a couple days ago, where she was analyzing a paper from a young earth creationist who actually was a very good young earth creationist and was actually trying sincerely to advance the science to prove his point and was not being dishonest about it. But one of the things that she pointed out was that in trying to prove his point, he had some errors with sample size.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, and that's often an inductive argument. Like 12 people enjoying apple doesn't mean everybody enjoys apple. But if you had sampled 99% of the population and they enjoyed apple, you can probably say that most of the rest are going to enjoy apple.
Okay.
And what you did there by sort of, drawing that analogy, it's a great way to help yourself understand things and apply it to a number of different situations. But I mean, it's also another form of inductive reasoning as well. You could speak to, you've seen a number of different trees, you know what a load of trees look like. You see this new thing that just happens to have a certain tree-ness about it. So you inductively reason, it's probably a tree. Now, it might not actually be if you were then to experiment on it and find out that actually it doesn't have all the properties that would make it a tree.
Mm-hmm.
But then you'd be sort of applying a more deductive reasoning at that point.
It could be a piece of scenery left behind from some outdoor play that somebody was doing.
Exactly. It just looked like a tree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Church I attended had a bunch of fake trees at the back of it, and because they weren't real trees and they didn't have real soil in the pots, they were very light, and it was easy to move them around on the stage, but they also fell over really easily, and they were always knocking them over.
Brilliant. So I mean that's mostly inductive reasoning. Did you want to go a bit more into deductive reasoning, Dave? I know we sort of skirted around it.
Yeah, deductive reasoning could be sort of considered a priori. Inductive reasoning is a posteriori. In other words, we get it from our experience of the world. But a priori arguments are arguments where we can deduce it from non-experience. So if we say like, if I oversleep, I'll be late, because it generally tends to be the case. I mean, there's people who argue that, you know, a priori arguments still based on a posterior, because we still have to have these experiences in order to have the words and to be able to build up the arguments. But if you were to say, if I oversleep tomorrow, I'll be late for my interview, that's a sort of deductive argument, because, you know, you don't need to experience that you've overslept to know that if you oversleep, you will be late. So you can deduce from generalities to a particular. So generally, if you oversleep, you'll be late for whatever you're going to do. You haven't overslept, so therefore you're late. You've deduced from a generality to a particular, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and something you can say there is the conclusion with deductive reasoning is guaranteed, whereas inductive, it's like it's most likely
Inductive,
the
it's
case.
not. Yeah.
Yeah. With deductive
Okay.
reasoning, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true as well. I mean,
Yeah.
you could really
Sorry.
translate it. Oh, no, go for it, Dave.
I was just going to say, with an inductive argument, you don't speak in terms of validity and soundness. You speak in terms of probability.
Whether it's cogent or not is another way to put it. So, I mean, if you think about deductive reasoning as well, I mean, like, essentially maths is a sort of a form in that. So if x equals 10 and y equals 5, then 2x minus y equals 15, you know. And then you go back to the syllogisms that Dave mentioned earlier. I mean, if you want another example of a sound syllogism, all mammals are animals. Elephants are mammals, therefore elephants are animals.
Okay. We have a
can.
question. Go ahead, Dave, and then
Sorry,
I'll
go
get
ahead.
to the question. Okay.
I was-
Right. Question is from Native Atheist, who says, arguments for God, any type of reasoning. Let me take a stab at this myself, and then you correct me. The Kalam, definitely deductive reasoning, because it has a syllogism and comes to a conclusion. Let's see. Let's
Moral
see.
argument?
Moral argument. The moral argument will be inductive, wouldn't it? Or is that also deductive?
I think it's deductive, isn't it? You know what? I said it.
I'd say it was deductive.
Yeah, because it follows that
you're
same
generalizing.
pattern.
Yeah. You're not saying all these people are moral, therefore they're moral because of God. Or every time we see morality, we see an example of God. So the next time, it's not built off experiences that the world is trying to deduce from the fact that there are moral properties, and moral properties can only be bestowed by some kind of moral property giver. Therefore, there is a moral property giver.
Okay. The other one I'm trying to think of, and for some reason the name of the argument is slipping my mind. The intelligent design, the design argument. That
Teleological.
Teleological. Thank you. That would also be an example of deductive reasoning.
It would. And like you were saying about it being inductive, that's one of the reasons that a lot of people say most deductive arguments are kind of based on induction anyway. It's just that the way that they reason is slightly different.
Okay. Okay. So pretty much all of them are deductive.
As far as I'm aware, yeah. Same as like the contingency argument.
Yeah, I mean, but based around those ones, I'm sure that if someone was making a personal argument, it might not be, because they might be talking about their experiences and things like that. But, you know, again, you sort of sometimes cross the lines. You might think that you've made a deductive argument, but actually you've got an error in there somewhere, and part of the premise is actually based on inductive logic, and therefore, you know.
The one that I was thinking that might be inductive would be the argument that, okay, basically the look at the trees argument. trees appear to have design. Design must come from a creator. Therefore, there is a creator because trees are designed.
I mean, the way you laid it out there was sort of
Yeah,
deductive.
that was, yeah, it
It's
is. It
deductive,
is.
yeah.
But I
Um,
guess the way it's laid out more is just that you look at a tree, you see a creator, therefore there is a creator.
which is that bit. That's why I'd say that bit is that particular premise is sort of based on induction. That particular premise, but the
Mhm.
actual argument you presented was a deductive argument.
Deductive argument. Okay, a deductive argument with an inductive premise.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, and that's the difference between the deduction.
Oh,
We lost you then again,
Or
Dave.
Dave is junk shopping.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
We got that's the difference.
Yeah, that's sort of the difference between the induction and the deduction. If you see it go from a generality to a specific, then you have a deductive argument. If you see it go from specifics to a generality, then you have an inductive argument. That's a nice shortcut.
Okay. Thank you.
Which way round is the
That's
funnel?
very helpful. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Which way round is the funnel?
Okay. I'm trying to keep up with the chat as we go along.
Yeah, you've got loads going on there. I can imagine it's hard to keep up with. I have trouble
we
on
have
ours,
enough
and it's
problems with
nowhere
our
near
5
as
people.
busy.
Yeah.
And I suppose the last main one that to cover off is abductive reasoning, if you want, Dave.
Yeah, abductive reasoning is basically inference to the best explanation. So if you knock at the door of somebody's house and they don't answer, you sort of infer that they're not home. I mean, they could just be avoiding you, obviously, or they could be asleep. But generally, when we knock at somebody's door, they don't answer, we'll kind of deduce that they're either not home or they're busy, same as a phone call. So you're just trying to make the best conclusion and infer it from sort of very general principles.
Yeah, I mean, abductive reasoning is the sort of thing that you would see more often than not than day to day. It's how we reason day to day. Even your doctor will generally be doing abductive reasoning. You've gone in, say you've gone to your GP, and you've listed a couple of symptoms, and they go, well, God, it could be this, probably based on this, most likely this one. There you go, try that. They might ask you a few more questions to try and see if you've got any other symptoms you haven't listed out. But then what about if you're unconscious? You're unconscious, they've done a blood test, they've got that information, but they don't know any of the symptoms you experienced beforehand or anything like that. They have to completely abductively sort of get what they can from an unconscious body. Obviously, in the terms of things like if you've broken your leg and they do an X-ray, cool, they've deduced the problem. They've got a complete data set there, and it's an obvious conclusion. But in general, day-to-day stuff,
Look for horses, not zebras.
Yes.
That's the general rule that the doctors have is, when looking at symptoms, first look at the horses before you start considering zebras.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. There's also one other part that we can put on through rationality. Because obviously we've spoken about, if you're reasoning in the accordance to the rules of logic and this type of reasoning, you could be in a rational position, or if you've done it badly, you're in an irrational position. But there's sort of things that aren't reasoned at all. Sensory things, emotional things. So you get a piece of chocolate in your mouth and you go, I like that. You haven't thought about it much. Now, you could then reason from that and go, I should go and buy lots of chocolate. I should live off of chocolate. And you might go, oh,
that sounds rational to me.
But then you can have an irrational point of view off of something that is, emotional or sensory. But this is generally regarded as irrational, as in it's not related to rationality. The A is sort of like not. Sort of like how amoral, if you're talking about amoral, is a behavior that is not related to morality. Like me drinking a glass of water has no relation to morality. It's neither moral or immoral. It's an amoral action.
Okay. In day-to-day conversation, do you use a lot of what you know about logic and reason?
I hope so, but probably not.
I try to. One of the things about logic is that it can be kind of dispositional. In other words, it becomes part of our nature. So the more you practice it, the more subconscious it gets, and the more it kind of plays into your thought processes, and you begin using it in everyday life. But according to the rationality debate, and you can find people like Emerson Tversky and Kahneman arguing stuff like this. None of us are rational. I know it sounds like a pretty harsh thing to say, but they take what's known as the standard picture of rationality, which is what Joe mentioned earlier, that being rational is reasoning according to the rules of logic and probability theory, etc. And none of us can do that perfectly well. So therefore, none of us are rational. But you also have people like David Papineau who argue that different kinds of rationality. There's everyday rationality and theoretical rationality. So you can be perfectly rational in your everyday day-to-day life, but not perfectly rational in theoretical reasoning, because we all have cognitive biases, which are sort of shortcuts in our thinking. And they come because of evolution. When you kind of evolve, you can't rebuild your brain. So evolution kind of co-ops some of our cognitive systems.
Not to mention the brain takes so much energy, so it needs these shortcuts.
Yeah,
otherwise
it.
It'd be
It needs these shortcuts. Yeah, we'd be tired every hour of the day. So what could have been our rule assessing cognitive faculty could now become our probability assessing. Still getting up, and therefore affect our rationality.
Okay. You mentioned the rationality debate. What is the rationality debate?
It's an ongoing discussion about whether or not humans are rational, what it means to be rational, what rationality is, and that kind of thing. And it kind of takes place between philosophy and psychology and neuroscience.
Okay. And we have a comment, a super chat from Godless Scummer who says, I can testify that Joe doesn't always use reason. For example, I know drinking more Guinness won't end well for us. So let's drink more Guinness.
It was a good night, though. A really good night. At least what I can remember of it. Apart from falling asleep on the bus on the way home, which was a 20-minute journey and ended me taking 2.5 hours to get home.
Oh, goodness.
But other than that, it was a really good night.
You needed a day out anyway.
I did.
I think all of us do after the pandemic.
Yeah.
But what you bring up there, Dave, as well, about things that get in the way of the reasoning process. I mean, I think that they're actually a good point in the discussion to make. There are so many different things. Like Dave mentioned, there's the cognitive biases. So something to remember is that you might have a cognitive bias. So if you react really quickly to a bit of information and go, no, that's crap. Is it? That's what you've then got to ask yourself, because especially if this is a topic that really interests you and you think, you know, it's important to you some way, or it could affect you in some way, then actually having a snappy response to it isn't always the best. You should constantly reconsider it. But I mean, this is why you need to be pragmatic with it. And on the time and energy point is the fact that, well, actually, this doesn't affect me. I'm not interested in the conversation. So I'm probably not even going to bother getting this conversation. They've said this thing. I don't really care about it. Yeah, whatever. And carry on. But, if it is something that could seriously affect you or your family or friends, or it's a topic you're really passionate about, if you love having conversations about morality or Christianity or Islam, spend the time looking into them, and don't just have oh yeah, it's just all bullshit. And, well,
Yeah.
Which,
One
ahead,
thing I
Dave.
like to remind people of is that we all suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect to some degree. A lot of people might find it insulting, but it just is a cognitive bias. We all tend to have this thing where when we have a limited amount of information, we think we know a lot about the topic because we don't know how much we don't know. And to be a better reasoner, if you keep that in the back of your mind at all times, you're less likely to jump in and allow your ego to take over and start thinking you know everything.
Yeah, a prime example of this sort of thing happening is for anyone who's ever worked in an office, you might have a team of analysts, and I used to work on a team of analysts, and part of the skill set there was to have advanced knowledge of Excel. And people would come into the team and they would they'd say, oh yeah, I've got an advanced knowledge of Excel, this is part of the interview process. And you go, okay, it's cool, so what can you do? And they knew some things that on a business level are considered advanced, but when you actually know the program, there's a hell of a lot more can do. And they don't know any of that, but they assume because they know that this have very small scope of knowledge, they can do a VLOOKUP and use pivot tables, that they've got this incredibly advanced knowledge. And then they're blown away when they see all this more. And you've broken that bias. And all of a sudden they dip down and they go, oh my God, there's so much I don't know. And that is true for pretty much everything that we ever learn.
That dovetails with a comment that I was waiting to get to from Julie, who says a good example of rationality being affected by evolution is fear of the dark, or seeing a scary shape in the dark that turns out to be a pile of laundry.
Yeah, you're not scared of the dark. You're scared of not being alone in the dark.
And that gets to an argument that, as a believer, I thought was profound, but as an unbeliever, I realized was not so profound, which it comes from Brown. I can't remember. Steve Brown used to always say, once you see truth, you can't unsee it. And what I came to realize is what you see as true, you can come to realize that what you were seeing was not exactly right. As Dave mentioned, you were seeing it with a particular bias, and the way I relate it is like, I'm going for a walk, I'm 200 yards from a mailbox, and from that perspective the mailbox looks like a dog, and as I get closer I realize it wasn't a dog, it was a mailbox. And it's not that the truth of what it was changed, it's just my perspective on it changed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, great way to put it.
Humans are pattern recognition machines at the end of the day. We are induction machines. We are built for induction. So you saw a pattern, you thought, oh, that's what it is. And then you confirmed what it is when you got closer. And as you say, the truth didn't change. Just your understanding of the truth changed.
This is why people like David Packenow and people like Chater and Oakenfeld argue that there is two different types of rationality. Just going by the theoretical rationality isn't enough, because there's this sense of everyday rationality, and the theoretical rationality would say that you're irrational for not gathering all the data before you make your assessment about the mailbox and judge it to be a dog. But in day-to-day life, we don't always have that. And if you see a snarling dog growling at you, and it's just scared, and if you go up to it and pet it, it's going to be friendly, you don't often have the time to actually assess that data. And it's safer for you to just go, that dog is snarling and growling at me, I'm not going to pet it. Yeah, that's a sense of everyday rationality.
Okay, that makes sense.
There's There's other problems with general reasoning as well. So
Okay.
Dave mentioned information availability, and that's a good one. But there's other problems with information. Sometimes the information can be incredibly complex. I mean, I'm just a layperson, but I've got an interest in philosophy. And some of the philosophical stuff I read, I sit there going page after page, going and looking up what all these different words mean and everything. And in the end, quite often I go, Dave, what does this mean? Because it is really hard to understand some of this stuff. So the complexity of the information can also make it hard to understand. And if you might think you understand it, and therefore you get it wrong. On top of that, time to read and verify the information as well. Consider something new came out about evolution, and it was this 50-long article, and you've got an interest in evolution, but actually you've got to work, you've got family, you've got everything else going on in your life, and you want to read the information you do, but you haven't got the time to, one, go through every single page, and two, verify everything to other sources. And so to an extent, you then start relying on experts and the peer review process and their conclusions and the shortened versions of it. And you've got to then understand that you're actually basing your perception on someone else's perception. And hopefully they're an expert in that field, because then there's more chance that their perception is correct. And if there's a consensus of experts saying the same thing, then you can generally go, okay, so I can sort of accept their summary of this. And that's what we do day-to-day life. But then we have a problem when we start trusting these experts without remembering maybe they could be wrong, and then going and trusting them in things that they're not experts in. You know, if if you were to suddenly talk to, I don't know, Richard Dawkins or someone like that about plumbing, you know, he might not actually know anything about it, but heard this one thing from his mate, and he'll just go, "Oh yeah, just do that." You know, you just twist the thing with this wrench. You know, it's fine. And actually, that's the exact wrong thing to do. But you believe him because it's Richard Dawkins. Well, you know, he's not a specialist in this. You know, if it was some sort of evolutionary argument, especially if it's an older one, then fine. You know, it's fine to trust him, especially if there is that consensus. But on things that they're not experts in, but this is going back to the bias. You formed a bias to this person, and you go, yes, they're always right about things. They're always right about science. They're always right about science. They're always right. I can trust them for anything. But it's natural for us to do. It's, again, bringing it back to that awareness. When you have that instant response to, oh, yes, I trust you. Oh, hang on. Why do I trust you? Oh, I trust you because of your experience in this, but that's got nothing to do with this. Maybe I need to take a step back and reconsider things.
Yeah, that's why I kind of often really hate when people yell out argument from authority fallacy. Because most people are misusing it. It's perfectly fine to argue from like applicable authorities. Like if you say, well, evolutionary biologists argue this, people will say, well, that's an argument from authority, but you're not specifically saying it's true because of this. You're just simply using them as an authority because they're experts in their field.
Yeah, it can be part of your set for your justification why you do it. You know, the bulk of experts think this way on this particular topic. The evidence says this. Bringing up an expert isn't, as Dave says, an argument from authority fallacy. You know, it's just part of your data set. And that's one of the things that I often see. Many people like to play fallacy bingo, especially on the atheist side. We you know, instead of engaging in the conversation, it's looking for what the fallacy is and going, you've made this one, you've made that one. But a fallacy is just an error in reasoning, and it doesn't necessarily mean the conclusion is false. And quite often, they misunderstand what the fallacy is as well. And they're getting the fallacy wrong. Straw man gets used so often to mean, well, I don't agree with you. And it's like, No, that's not what a straw man is. You cite an expert, or you cite a ton of experts who on history, for example, and they go, well, that's an argument from popularity or an argument from authority. You go, well, that's sort of how history works. The entire historical process is actually looking at all of the available information, and everyone's coming up to their own conclusions, and all the stuff that they agree on is generally taken to be, well, this is our best possible guess at history. I'm talking sort of ancient history wise, and the stuff around the fringe is generally thought of, well, no, that doesn't seem as likely, or it could be maybe. But that's just sort of how some of these things work. It's not the same as getting a scientific readout, doing an experiment on things. You can't do that with a lot of ancient history.
One thing that you brought up is something that I have observed over the decades, and I really have my hat off to the younger generation that is trying to grow up with the media bombardment that they have to face. When I was younger, I read a lot. I read all the time, and now I rarely read because I will sit down with a book and I get through 2 pages, and part of my mind is saying, "What's going on Twitter?
Yeah.
How many views have I had on my latest video?" And, "Oh, I'll just check real quick, and I'll come back to the book," and I don't.
Yeah,
And there
2
is
hours
so
later.
much. Yeah, I think young people, are so bombarded with so much information that it is really hard to block it out and concentrate on one thing.
Definitely, there's too much easy entertainment as well. Young people, and even myself, I'm not very good at being bored. Right? I mean, the second a conversation dies, I look at my phone, and I can't help it. I have to try really hard. I have to go and put my phone away somewhere. Otherwise, I'm just, and I get lost in it, and then I don't hear what anyone else says either. I'm just lost on the infinity scroll. Ooh, good meme. You know, and they can't handle being bored. I mean, I don't actually let my daughter watch that much TV, but in the morning, whilst I'm having my coffee and whilst I'm making dinner in the evening, are the 2 times she gets to have something on, because it just keeps her focus and doesn't keep her pulling on my leg. In fact, it still doesn't always work. But if I put on something like YouTube because there's there's this baby yoga thing on there that's really good that she likes, or something sensory or some learning thing, and an advert comes up, she's just instantly like, ah! And it's just like, well, hang on, just wait. It's 10 seconds. No, make it go. I mean, she is only 2, but she's already used to the Netflix world where there are no commercial breaks or anything like that. I mean, we used to have all of these commercial breaks in there. You'd only have 4 channels, and generally there'd only be 1 or 2 things you'd want to watch in an evening anyway. And now you've got so much choice and so much entertainment, you end up not doing other things that you would otherwise have wanted to do. And like you, I used to read so much. I used to read book after book, mostly fiction, stuff like Terry Pratchett and all that. But I find it hard to get the time to do it now. I mean, a busy family, streaming, video editing, and all of that as well. I'm doing a lot. But when I do sit down and have a few minutes, like you, I go, ooh, I've got a comment on the video, or new notification on Twitter. Oh, and then you get stuck in that infinity scroll. Like, I don't know how to get out of it. I've just actually downloaded a new screen for my phone. It's supposed to be minimalist, and if you go into the app, it puts a timer on it and tells you when that time is up and tells you to actually get off. So you can jump into Twitter and go, I only want to be on Twitter for 5 minutes. And when it pops up with that message, you're like, okay. But so far, I haven't been strong enough to be okay. I just go, oh, just give me another 5 minutes. So it's not working yet. But I'm trying.
Yes, yes. I'm trying to get through Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, and as I was reading the first chapter, I was just blown away because I've not read Dawkins before, and I'm in the mind of a genius here. And yet, even with this, I'm only reading a few pages at a time.
Yeah, I haven't read The God Delusion, but I did read The Selfish Gene. Or I should say, I read half The Selfish Gene and then left the plane on the book. But what I did read
You
was
left
really
the
good.
plane on the book.
The
Bloody
other way
big
around.
version of it. Yeah.
Wordsing is hard, okay?
Well, it's very early in the morning.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Oh. There's another topic in here that I kind of want to get to, but are we done with this topic? Did you want to add anything to that, Dave, before I switch us on topic?
No, that's good. I mean, there's some stuff that we could probably discuss about, like logical entailments of our beliefs and how we should follow them when doing good reasoning, but that can come after whatever
Okay.
topic.
Yeah, hold that thought because I don't think this one is going to take very long, but remind me to get to that right after that. And that is, I wanted to bring up this comment from Philip Mueller. Now, he previously, and I'm not sure exactly where it was, made a comment with regards to the incorrect use of ad hominem. Yeah, and then he adds, insulting someone is just that, an insult. It only ever becomes fallacious if it's used as a mean to conclude that someone is wrong, and even that exceptions exist. My personal experience with being accused of ad hominem attacks incorrectly is when I attack an idea and someone accuses me of an ad hominem, and I said, I didn't say anything about the person, only the person's idea. But evidently, Philip Mueller sees it going in this direction as well. This is something I have not seen.
So that the way Philip describes it is the way I've generally experienced it. But I can explain a little bit of probably the cognitive process that someone goes through when they see you attacking the idea. If you say, I mean, especially deeply held beliefs, they form part of an identity, right? So if you say this belief is stupid, that translates to I am stupid for believing this. Therefore, you are calling me stupid. And that is probably where they're going. But even then, you're just insulting them. So, but that's probably what's going on inside. And that's why I try and say, rather than actually attacking the belief, try and address the belief, try and point out why you think it's wrong rather than why you think it's stupid, because you might get a better conversation. And in fact, maybe before you even address why you think it's wrong, asking more sort of open questions about it and letting them explain why they accept this particular thing first, and then going to each bit, go, well, how does that work? Does this justify this? And but doesn't this contest this bit? And isn't there a contradiction here? And trying to make them realize that maybe their reasoning to that belief isn't quite as rational as they'd hoped. Their belief could still be true, but their reasoning might be false. And if you focus on that bit, they might then take a step back. They'll probably get really angry all the same, but they won't suddenly go, you've done an ad hom, and shut down the conversation and just stonewall. They'll have actually had something that might percolate in their mind, and they might come back a few days later and go, so I've been thinking on this one a bit more.
Okay. Very good point. Did you want to add anything with regards, or Dave, with regards to Philip's comment?
No, I agree with it. It's like ad hom gets used a lot incorrectly because, like you said, when you've had it where you've attacked an idea and somebody has said you're committing an ad hom, or like somebody mentioned Matt Powell, he did a video recently about how childish atheists are. I think that was the same guy.
I remember the video. I don't know the name, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's him. And that was basically a 5-minute long ad hom. Because what he was doing was saying, well, all your arguments against God are terrible because you enjoyed Deadpool, and Deadpool is for childish people. That's an example of an ad hom. Because you're saying their conclusion must be false because they do this childish thing. Whereas if you were just to turn around to Matt Powell and say, you're a child, That's not an ad-hom because you're not attacking his arguments. You're saying
just
he's an
attacking
idiot.
him.
He
Yeah.
is a child.
But that's
I
not why
hadn't
his
even
mum.
heard of him before that.
No,
Yeah.
neither
To
had
me,
I.
anyone,
Jack was actually in that video as well, wasn't he?
to me, anyone under 35 is a child.
Yeah.
That's because my oldest child is currently 35.
Oh, fair.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Next year,
Yeah.
anyone under 36 will be a child.
To be fair, I mean, I'm 38 and I still feel like a child. So, especially after
Mentally,
shaving.
yeah. Yeah, you look about 15 once you've shaved.
But yeah,
Okay.
actually, on that note, I even created a poll off of the back of that, didn't I? And I asked whether you were a non-theist and you liked comic book stuff or an anime, or did 4 options for non-theists and theists. And it turned out overwhelmingly that pretty much everybody liked either comic books or anime or anything like that. So his argument, even then, even if it wasn't an ad hom, would just not work.
No.
Okay, let's get back to the topic that you brought up, Dave, and I can't even remember what it was.
Logical entailments of our beliefs.
Okay, thank you.
So you can tell I'm much more awake than I was last time I was on. I actually have a memory. Yeah. So if we're going to be good reasoners, there are certain things that kind of follow from our beliefs. And there are things logically entailed by our beliefs. So if you say no testimony can be trusted, then it would follow that none of the books that you read on science or evolution can be trusted, because they're simply the testimony of the people that have actually studied these things. You're not getting it from direct experience. Testimony is anything relayed through writing or
verbal
kind of oratory. Yeah. And so if you say testimony can't be trusted, then when Fauci says wear a mask, it stops thing, unless you actually go out and perform those experiments, you're taking them on testimony. So you have 2 conflicting beliefs there. So it should be logically entailed that either you can trust their testimony and therefore some testimony is trustable, or if no testimony is trustable, you shouldn't be taking information from books and like learning from your teachers and that kind of thing. So we all have certain beliefs that logically entail other things. And if you want to be a good reasoner and not be in contradiction with yourself, you should be following those logical entailments and holding the beliefs that are logically entailed by previous beliefs.
Okay.
There's lots of them that you would see on the internet. People don't follow their entire conclusion through to the end. That, I mean, no, do you know what? I'm not even going to bring up the rocks.
Actually, I was thinking of the Calvinists.
Okay. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, see, that's kind of a good example because they believe that everything is sort of predestined. So they believe from what they have kind of figured out, follow those logical entailments. So that even though their reasoning might not seem rational to us, they have actually kind of followed some pretty good reasoning because they've actually followed those logical entailments.
And that's
the rocks.
Yeah, that's what led me out of Christianity, was thinking Calvinism through, because I had been a Calvinist. And when I started thinking through that if God has predestined the elect to heaven, and the thought that had never occurred to me until that moment was that also means he predestined the rest to hell. And they are not condemned because of anything that they did or they thought or they failed. It was because that was God's sovereign choice. And that is what broke Christianity for me.
Yeah.
That's really good, yeah, because that's following the logical entailments of the Calvinism and going, well, if what they say about God being all loving and all good is true,
Exactly.
then why would he do these things? Yeah, so that's very good reasoning as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
Most Calvinists will stop at that bit and go, well, that's enough, but they haven't gone on
Exactly.
to the logical entailments of that. Yeah,
Exactly. You only think about what this means to my set, and you don't think about what it means to everybody outside of your group.
yeah,
No.
perfect way to put it. And most of us kind of do that. We get to this satisfactory position and we kind of stop because, well, I know, like, you'll hear a lot of people say, you shouldn't believe something just because it feels good. But a lot of people, when they're reasoning, will get to this point where it feels good and then stop and not continue to follow on from what that means.
Exactly. And Aunt Jur asked a good question. Granny, why don't we see more women Calvinists in the apologetics community or even in general? And the answer is because they're not allowed. Most Calvinist churches are very conservative, and
Right.
they do not permit a woman to teach in any position where a man might be learning from the teaching. So women can lead women's Bible studies, they can lead a women's retreat, but they cannot teach. A woman can write a book that a man might happen to pick up and read, but a woman cannot teach an adult Sunday school class where men might be attending. Women can't preach, and so women cannot be apologists.
That was that part of Timothy or something like that?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I do not permit a woman to teach a man. Yep.
Yeah. Fair. Quite old school. And I just thought it was because we men were too busy mansplaining religion. Oh, yeah. That's brilliant. I don't know if you've seen that clip that Jeff's bringing up right now. But there's this whole scene of Elmo and Abby, and she's got a pet rock,
Rock.
and
Mhm.
she's got an extra cookie for the rock, and Elmo's not allowed to have any of it because it's for the rock, and he's just getting more and more frustrated with it's just a rock, it's not alive, it's no, why are you giving it food, why are you saying it believes this, and it's brilliant.
It is. Let's see. Crabby Hermit says, why do I persist in an activity that makes my hand numb? Because I want to finish the panel. Why do I do things that make me hurt? Because no one else is going to do it. Circular Hutch.
You could argue that there's an end goal in mind. I mean, I the first line, I wasn't entirely sure where that was going.
I love Crabby Hermit. She and I are about the same age, and we have a lot in common.
Nice one.
I take it that she's some form of cartoonist or something with the whole panel, like doing.
I think she was referring to our panel, possibly. I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Let's see. I'm not sure what she was referring to at the panel. Or, yeah, there's a lot of things that could be.
Yeah. Well, if the activity made her hand numb and it was to do with stained glass, right? Fair.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. That must be quite rewarding to do when you finally finish it. I can imagine it's, as you mentioned, painful in the hands on the way.
Okay. All right. I did not have anything else for today. Are there any other topics that you think would be of benefit in elevating conversations or reasoning ability that you think would be good to discuss?
There's a couple of things I could mention that are probably things that we should try and do. Going back to the problems I mentioned, you should actually be pragmatic with the conversation. If it's a topic that's important to you, it might harm you depending on the conclusion or anything like that. You should take the time to look into it and discuss it. But actually, if you don't really care about it, don't even bother getting involved in the conversation. Don't just go, "Oh, it's stupid, you're an idiot." Forget that. If you don't care about the conversation, just don't have it. But I think if it's things that you do care about or could affect you in some way, or your family, your friends and so on, then you should think about the way you go forward, and obviously think about the types of reasoning that we've discussed already in the pitfalls, and try and make sure what you say is at the very least cogent. But when you're dealing with people, I think there's some things that we can do and we should try to do to ensure that we are having as good of a conversation as we can. And the first one is, I think, assume the person is intelligent, even if what they say seems a bit disjointed, right? Maybe they're not speaking in their first language, or
That's something
maybe
I always consider. Yeah.
you got to try. I mean, and start off with that and keep persisting it with, assuming they're intelligent, and also assume they're an honest actor. Assume that they are genuinely looking to have this conversation with you. They're not looking to just beat their chest and go, "Ha, I'm right, you're irrational, you're wrong," or whatever. Assume that they're actually there for the conversation. Treat them like a human being. Treat them how you would like to be treated in this conversation, right? And you want to be treated as if you're intelligent, as if you're an honest actor. Treat them the same. Have a proper conversation with them instead of trying to win points in debate. Don't let your experiences with other people of a similar position, like Sarit. So say you speak to a lot of fundamentalists or a lot of creationists, young earth creationists, and let's just say most of the time those conversations are absolutely awful, and you have this new one pop up and want to talk with you. Don't assume that they're instantly like that person. We see it far too often that people will relate religion to Christianity, and Christianity to fundamentalism, and fundamentalism with biblical literalism. And I've proved biblical literalism wrong, and that therefore all religion is false. And you're like, again, that this bad reasoning going on there. And you can say the same sort of thing when you're dealing with people. Every creationist that I've spoken to so far has been absolutely awful, so therefore they all are. Well, no, take the time, treat each person as a new person, as a blank template. In fact, even if one of them who you spoke to before comes back to you, and this isn't like a regular thing, but they actually try and have a conversation with you, give them another chance. Sometimes they're worth it. Maybe they were having a bad day before, they or you might have been in an emotional state. And that's another thing that can get in the way of the reasoning process. If I'm angry, if I'm feeling grumpy, if I've had a bad night's sleep, I will be less receptive to new information. I will be more prone to thinking you're wrong, just because I'm in a bit of a grumpy state. You might not be wrong. It's actually me that's in the wrong there. My emotions are getting in the way. So if you're in that state, try and be aware of that state and take a step back, remove yourself from the conversation, say, "I'm not feeling good today. Can we have this conversation another day?" Don't be combative at all. Stop trying to win points in debate and get, pats from all the other people on your team. Forget about this tribalistic us versus them mentality. Try and hold a conversation where you're both on a journey searching for truth together. Try and understand each other's perspectives. And do you know what? You may disagree with them, they may disagree with you, but you might find that actually you agree on a hell of a lot more things. I've got a young earth creationist friend that I met through Twitter, right? And apart from the young earth creationist stuff, we are very, very alike. And he's an absolutely great guy. And we have a lot of conversations about things. And actually, we just forget about the young earth creation and stuff, because you know what? He's never going to convince me, and I'm never going to convince him on this topic. There's nothing that pops up unless there's some new science that actually proves it one way or another. Will I be convinced? And he's already rejecting the science on this particular topic. So therefore, there's no point in us having this conversation. But we can talk about a number of different things. We can look at both our own tribes and each other's tribes and have these conversations and talk about our behaviors and talk about, I got really annoyed the other day and I did this thing, have all these conversations. How could I have done this better? What do you disagree with in this article? And so on and so forth. So take the time to listen and understand the person, not just their particular position, but more about them, how they came to their conclusions and their justifications for their belief. And if they bring up something that you don't know, feel free to admit ignorance. I don't know that. You know what? I'm going to have to take some time to read this. I don't have some time right now. But if this is an important part of the conversation that we're going to have a few days to read it and we'll have to come back to this. If not, then, we'll have to move on. But you have to bear in mind, I don't know this bit. There's nothing wrong with admitting you don't know, especially if you're the sort of person who is going to be willing to look for more information on the topic. And if they provide you some reading material, sometimes I think it's worth reading. In fact, more often than not, it's worth reading it. Now, I will go against myself there and I'll say, based on a site like Answers in Genesis, I will, tend to avoid a site like that because I've spent a lot of time reading their articles, and when they're discussing science, it's really bad, really, really, really bad. So if they're bringing up something scientific based on my previous experience, and if someone says, yeah, check this proves creationism, and they give me a link to Answers in Genesis, generally, I don't care enough about the conversation. If I still got involved in those conversations and was trying to convince creationists that their belief is in error, then yeah, I would carry on reading it. But it's not a conversation I care about anymore. And so for that sort of conversation, I wouldn't get involved in it. And if someone starts spamming me with links, it just, it's not worth it. But if it's a conversation that you're interested in, say you're really interested in morality or artificial intelligence, and they give you a link and say, oh, what do you think about this new theory that's just come out about this thing? Oh, yeah. And you spend the time reading it and take time over your responses. One of the benefits with the internet and social media is actually you don't have to respond right away. And you can write and rewrite a response. Obviously, in a conversation like we're having now, there isn't exactly as much time to respond because it's a live conversation like it's in the real world. But that's not the same with when you're on Twitter. You don't have to give that response right away. And I know that there is that temptation. I have to respond. But actually, if you feel that you need to respond, then just say, I need to think on this some more. I'll come back to this in a bit, rather than give your response right away. And I think that is something that we all do badly. I don't think, I can't talk. I don't think any of us take enough time over our responses and don't fully take the time to understand each other and what the person is saying. Quite often, I think that we assume what they're saying is what they're saying without taking the time to actually clarify. And we all think we're being clear when we say certain things, but quite often you'll see people using certain terminology and you'll say, how can that be the case? No, I wasn't saying that. Okay, but this word means this. You go, okay, if we had taken that conversation differently, I'd have gone, when you say this, how are you using the term? Oh, okay, that's a bit atypical to how it's usually used, but let's go with that. I understand your position on the topic. And all of a sudden, you've changed the dynamic of that conversation.
Very good. That is very good advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dave.
Yeah, I think principle of charity is something that's missing from a lot of discussions. We should always be trying to apply the principle of charity to our interlocutors' arguments. So, like an argument that, like when you hear the Kalam, a lot of atheists will say, well, that's not an argument for God. And that's because they're not giving it the best possible reading. And sure, it doesn't actually have the word God in it, but it's part of a bigger argument. So they're not applying the principle of charity to that. And they think just by saying, God's not in the argument, therefore it's not an argument for God. You're not really giving the argument justice, and therefore any kind of argument that you give against it isn't going to be a good argument. More often than not, when you don't apply the principle of charity to an argument and give it the strongest reading, you will be attacking a straw man of that argument. And we should be trying to avoid that if we're going to be, giving our best to something. Another thing is, like Joe mentioned, fallacy bingo. There's a lot of people who will just yell out fallacies and then think the argument is done. But a fallacy, unless it's in a formal fallacy, most informal fallacies don't guarantee that the conclusion isn't true. It's just that the reasoning that's got there doesn't guarantee the conclusion. And you still have to kind of point out why the reasoning is fallacious. So you need to kind of apply that a bit better if you're going to be a good reasoner. And you also have to be honest with yourself. Like, one of the hardest things is to be honest about our own arguments and our own conclusions. The example you brought up with Calvinism earlier was a perfect example. Most people reason to Calvinism and then stop there. So to be a good reasoner, you have to be honest with your conclusions as well. And going back to the Kalam thing, make sure you're interrogating the argument properly. Because if you're not interrogating the argument properly, you're not actually arguing against that argument. And another important thing is to actually learn about the topics. It's too easy to fall into a Dunning-Kruger situation where you think you know everything about the topic because you've heard a few words passed around. But hearing a bunch of people say a bunch of words doesn't necessarily mean that those people are actually using it correctly. And when we're stuck in our kind of echo chambers, might not be the right word, but when you're stuck in a big group that all use the term the same or make all these arguments, like to prove it, you can't prove a negative. That's quite a popular one within the atheist community. But if you actually go out and look, that's a completely false argument. So a lot of the times people don't actually check the information that's coming from the people that they like and admire. They just accept it. And to be a better reasoner, you really need to look at these popular sayings and go, well, are these actually correct? Many of us we're so focused on the other side that we think, well, I'm smart, they're dumb, therefore what I say is smart, and what people like me say is smart, therefore it must be correct. There's too much of that kind of goes on.
Okay.
And another thing is pick up a book on logic if you're interested in it. There's one called Logic from Wilfred Hodges, which is a really good basic introductory text. And I think it's called Introducing Logic by Shufan Lee. That's another great one to pick up, and it's very in-depth.
Dave, after the stream is over, if you could send me a couple of links to those books, I will add those to the description.
Yeah, no worries. I'll send you a message on Twitter with.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what Dave also mentions there, is talking about some of the us versus them mentality. It's one of the things that we've tried to do by addressing bad atheist arguments and bad atheist memes and things like that, both on our blog and on our channel, and even in conversations on Twitter. And we're atheists ourselves. We believe gods don't exist, but we notice that there are some errors in reasoning, and we do our best to explain why these errors in reasoning are. But instead of having that conversation, people get into that combative mode and then other us and, oh yeah, you're clearly theist trolls, or you're apologists, you're cult leaders, or
Okay.
Yeah, I get that a lot. I must be a theist in disguise because I'm arguing against other atheists.
Well, thank you very much, Dave and Joe, for joining me. This has been an excellent conversation, and I think it's a really great way to help us elevate our conversations. One final thing before we go out is I like to give my guests a chance to shill for anything that they would like to shill for. And Dave, let's go ahead and you start. Tell us a little bit about your channel, what you do, and what you have coming up.
Well, I kind of have a personal channel, but there's only really reposts from my discussions with Joe on Answers in Reason on there, and there's like a top 30 atheist content creators that I think people should check out. But you'll mostly find me on Answers in Reason channel because we're kind of a crew. And on there, if you're interested in topics like this, Philip has a great one on logic. And I've done like a presentation on rationality and what it means and discussing the rationality debate. We've got other discussions on logic and using good reasoning and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, generally the same. There's some great conversations that I say in our sci-fi live streams, but there's also, if you don't really have the time for the longer streams that often, I do these things called sci-fi shorts, which are really quick overviews of topics. I try and get them into 5 minutes. The longest one is 15 minutes, but they're usually around the sort of 5 to 8 minute mark, and they can be really good at just going, actually, is this a topic I'm interested in? And if it is, then maybe going for one of the longer videos or looking up one of the articles. And yeah, we try and do articles. We've fallen a bit behind doing all the streaming, but on the answersinreason.com, if anyone's interested, there's a ton of different articles. And I know, Dave, you were planning on doing a bit of an intro to logic too, weren't you, Dave?
Yeah, with all the I was writing down all my thoughts and trying to kind of collect them together to go back to what I learned about logic. And I ended up writing a whole bunch of pages, and I'm probably now going to turn that into a kind of introduction to logic and discuss what the different argument forms are and how to kind of look at to make sure that your inferences are following from premise to conclusion and stuff like that. So that'll probably take a week or two to actually kind of put together.
Cool. I'm looking forward to seeing that. On my own show on Wednesday, Don't Be Deceived will be my guest, and he is a Calvinist. And so I am going to use some of what Joe just suggested to try to have a good and reasonable conversation with him.
Awesome.
And I also just finished a produced video. Dr. Jonathan Lachey recently complained on Twitter that atheists tend to go after low-hanging fruit. And I was surprised at who he picked as being low-hanging fruit, which was Gary Habermas. And I have always considered him to be a serious apologist. So someone responded to Dr. Lachey and asked, what do you consider to be a robust apologetic? And he posted a link to his own article. So that's what I responded to, Dr. Lachey's own article. And I will be releasing that immediately after this stream. So you can go and give that a look afterward.
Awesome. I'll check that out.
So Joe and Dave, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope that all of you in the chat have gotten something from this on how to have better conversations. And I thank all of you for your questions and your comments. You've made this a truly enjoyable stream. And with that,
thank you for having us on.
live your life.